Good evening, viewers, and welcome to Candid Talk episode 4. So today's session is entitled The History Women. Now, whenever we think of history, we typically think of kings and forts and battles, all of which talk of a man's world. And the corollary is, therefore, the writing of history is also a man's vocation. Now, in this special episode, we turn the lens to the work of 3 preeminent women writers whose work, whose books and scholarship have given a completely fresh perspective and shed a fresh light on our understanding of Indian history. While all the viewers know all 3 of our esteemed panelists today, even so, I think a somewhat more detailed introduction might be in order. So our first guest for this evening will be Dr. Ruby Lal, who's joining us from the US. Ruby is Professor of South Asian History at Emory University, and as an academic, her work over the past 2 decades has transformed our understanding when it comes to the basic fundamental question of gender in relation to history. And this transformation works across at least 2 major dimensions. A, the role of history in medieval times in contemporary society, and the role of historical women personages, such as the Empress Noor Jahan, but also in a different dimension, the role of women as chroniclers of history themselves, such as the Mughal Princess Gulbadan Begum. And I'd just like to put her work into perspective. So yesterday evening, viewers, I was moderating a session with the one and only William Dalrymple. And towards the back end of the session, there was a question that he was asked about the role of women and, who are the big female protagonists in Indian history. But without a moment's hesitation, not 1 second, he said, read Ruby Lal's books. Thereafter, he sort of qualified that. He made a couple of comments. He alluded to the fact that in White Mughals, there are female personages, etc. And then he paraphrased it again. He said, all of what I'm saying essentially is leveraging Ruby's work. So that is how definitive, how influential Ruby's work is. Our second guest for this evening would be Rana Safvi. Now, Rana ji is the undisputed chronicler in our times, when it comes to all the city settlements, the extant city settlements, of which there are 7, and the historical city settlements, of which there are probably 14, that together comprise what we know as Delhi. She's the author of numerous books, which are both widely acclaimed, critically acclaimed, as well as best-selling. Most notably, the trilogy, the Delhi trilogy, also called the trilogy Where Stones Speak. Now, as we all know, stones by themselves aren't sentient beings, but really it is Rana ji's unique perspective, and it is her literary gift that lends these stones a voice. And then last but not the least, we have Ira Mukhoty. Her meticulously researched, finely nuanced books on a wide range of subjects in Indian history have carved a niche for her, not just as an expert storyteller, but also as a highly imaginative researcher. So, case in point, take her latest book, which was published very recently, which is a biography of the Mughal Emperor Akbar. But whenever one is talking about primary sources, you would tend to talk about manuscripts, Persian manuscripts, or manuscripts written by contemporary Europeans, Jesuits, soldiers, adventurers, etc. But she's broken new ground, at least as far as Indian historiography is concerned, in focusing on Mughal miniature paintings, contemporary miniature paintings, and using that to enrich and inform her narrative. Not surprisingly, this, like her previous books, has won a lot of accolades from pundits all over the world. And I'll just give one example. The eminent Harvard historian, Professor Sugata Bose, in reviewing her work, called it the definitive 21st century biography of a 16th century monarch. So a very warm welcome to all 3 of you.
Thank you.
Ruby, we'll get started with you, if you may. When we're talking about academics in the social sciences, and my frame of reference is, 2 of my oldest friends are economists, the professors, and whenever I ask them to write a book on economics, on their subject of expertise. For a general reader, they always say, Avik, wait till I'm 75 years old. Otherwise, it's just going to dilute my work as an academic, something which I don't quite understand. But you seem to have cracked that bit, because on the one hand, you're doing this extremely deep technical academic work. And on the other hand, you have a very highly engaging, accessible for the general reader, a book like Empress. So how do you negotiate these two worlds?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Avik, for the invitation, and I'm delighted to be here with Rana and Ira. I think it's going to be a wonderful conversation. So, the two aspects that you're talking about, or imagined two aspects, the academic scholarly work and the work in which, narration and storytelling really takes center stage. In fact, I think are very deeply related. The more I think about Empress, the more I feel, that I don't think I could have done Empress without doing the kind of work that I've done before. And I say that because when I began writing, one of the things I thought, aside from the narration and the genre and the style, was that we actually take what is called as the wide audience for granted. We somehow think that there should be this, watered down narration somehow that should be handed out to them. That history that gets, soppy and soft and romantic. I wanted to keep my integrity as a historian, but really more centrally, somebody who has pondered and agitated over the question of the archive for a very long time and take it to the wider audience. But when I took my thinking and my deliberations by way of writing Empress to the wider audience, I was also actually questioning the genre of biography itself, right? What does biography mean? What is storytelling? I mean, storytelling is not just some obvious, simple setting the scenes and, writing a book. I think if we are to go by phenomenal thinkers like Walter Benjamin, who've written on the idea of storytelling, then there is quite often a moral in the storytelling. So what is that moral that I wanted to bring out in Empress? And the moral is, it seems an obvious one now, but the moral really was, when we think about the great Mughals of India, we think about the many Mughals of India. Well, there was one woman amongst them. And, that's deeply imbricated in history, that's very deeply imbricated in the way in which our politics is looking at. So all of those things, I didn't think that there is a divergence. Of course, Empress is very, very different from the academic jargon, the engagement of the intricacies of the archive. But then the major struggle was really how to take, all of that, weave that into, if I could, fantastic storytelling.
Absolutely. The book, the full title of the book is Empress, the Astonishing Reign of Noor Jahan, right? And to me, one of the most astonishing things, the feats, is the fact of that book itself, in a way. Because if you look at it from a historiographical standpoint, and the entire 20th century is replete with giants of history who are doing these huge volumes on Shivaji, on Aurangzeb, right? On other facets of history and other figures of history, and there are no women. And that also sort of has seeped into the 21st century, right? I mean, the moment you talk about a figure like Akbar, they will say, yes, which perspective are we looking for? Even with Jahangir, there's so many angles, there's so many perspectives and prisms through which you can view him. But the popular perception might be, and I'm just guessing here, is that whenever you talk about Noor Jahan, they'll say, yes, well, supposedly classic combination of beauty and brains, but not enough resources. She had no contemporary chroniclers. She didn't leave any memoirs. Possibly her influence and power towards the fading years of Jahangir's reign might have been overestimated, blah, 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 right? And you've really demolished all of that. So tell us about that.
Exactly. I think that is the heart of the problem. And I have increasingly problematize this in my mind as the problem of the male disbelief. And here's what I mean. Disbelief over generations, right? So the most contemporary sort of illustration of this is from the point of view of historians, when they say, where are the sources? And I think that is the smallest of the problems in the sense of, how do you here actually the problem is a really interesting one. On Noor Jahan, let's just focus on Noor Jahan for a minute. She's one of the most fabulously, thought through, recorded women from her own time up until the present century. So if you take the first case in point, which is the Jahangir Nama, when I began looking into the Jahangir Nama, people would say, well, but Jahangir doesn't say very much. You go into the Persian record, there are at least, that is the Persian, writings on the Jahangir Name, there are at least 32 entries on hunting and Noor Jahan's hunting. And I began to think, what's going on here? And here's the story, here's the backstory. He writes about hunting non-stop, that is Noor Jahan's hunting non-stop, because it's one of the informal signs of sovereignty at that time, right? Particularly the killing of the tigers, which is where my book opens. And I say this because writing at that time, this is where the intricacies of the archive begin to come in. He's writing in the stream of consciousness style. So he's not going to sit there and tell us, Ruby Lal or Ira Mukhoty or Rana Safvi 400 years down. This is the reason why I'm writing, about Noor Jahan's hunting. Likewise, let me give you another example. Actually, two other examples of this fantastic archival problem. In Rampur Raza Library, we have Noor Jahan holding the musket. It's a really unusual portraiture for several reasons, art historical reasons, as well as other reasons. One is that this is painted established by the painter laureate Abul Hassan. Okay, that is the great portraiture maker. He breaks from a variety of conventions of painting in order to paint this extraordinary moment in her life in which she is holding the musket. So I went around thinking, how does Abul Hassan imagine Noor Jahan in this moment, right? What's happening? There were issues of when the painting was actually made between 1612 and 1617. And there's a lot to be said about the chronology. So things like that. Last extraordinary manuscript in Aligarh Muslim Library, Mullah Kamil Shirazi, Fatnama and Noor Jahan Begum, which he writes in the same style as Rumi's Masnavi. Now, historians have called this panegyric. Okay, I want to turn around and ask, what is not panegyric in a courtly setting? And this is the moment in which we really chart this extraordinary feat in 1627 when she goes to rescue Jahangir, who had been captured by one of his noblemen. And this is really where I want to link this to the present moment. This is where, for the first time, the word fitna begins to appear in the manuscripts. Okay, and fitna means chaotic, it means disruptive, it's attacked to women's sexuality. There's a whole range of historical language to that term that then also begins to come into the Shah Jahani, chroniclers. And this is the beginning of male disbelief. Everything was okay. Her coming on the Jarokha was okay. Issuing coins was all right. But the fact that she could cross the battle lines and pull out, that was the problem. And then, of course, over time, there are other exotic representations, the love story. And so this is layer upon layer of wiping her out of history. That's the legacy we are dealing with here.
Mm-hmm. Quite fascinating. Ranaji, we'll come to you. And we would want to begin by knowing a little bit more about your talim, right? Which, as we understand, was the auspices of the Aligarh Muslim University, right? And you've been fortunate in that most of the stalwarts, Iqtidar Alam Khan, Athar Ali, and of course the great Irfan Habib Saab, Shirin Mutwiji, have all been your teachers and your professors. So tell me about the experience of that talim with them and how that's informed your worldview as a historian.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. And thank you, Avik, for inviting me for this show with such such an illustrious panel. Uh, I was English. I did my BA honors in English literature, and the English has been the standard subject for everybody in my family. Presume that I would also do my masters in English and then probably go on to sit for the civil services exam. But it was just a chance in 1976 when India was under emergency. It was a chance speech where I heard Professor Khan had been talking about the emergency, and he, of course, gave a speech laced with history. And history was my subsidiary subject at that time. And when I heard it, I asked, I said, who is he? And I was told he's the head of the Department of History in the university. I was in the Women's College at that time. So I said, this is the subject I want to study. And so when I came back for my master's, I applied for history instead of English. And I was very fortunate to have studied under people who were masters at that time. As you mentioned, Professor, of course, Professor Irfan, Professor Tarali, Professor Iqtidar Alam, Professor S.P. Verma, who is an art historian, Professor God, who taught us ancient history. So I don't think there was anybody who was not authority on the subject at that point of time. So it was a wonderful experience, and I think I got spoiled studying under such experts.
Well, we are the winners of that spoilage for sure. So at what point of time did it evolve, or did you figure out that this is going to be your big subject when you're talking about the edifices, the ruins, the debris, which is strewn all across the metropolis of NCR? Because that's quite a unique subject that you've made your life's work.
So my journey after my master's, I didn't continue my PhD, though I had thought I would, but whatever reasons, I couldn't do that. I got married, I had a family. I started teaching in a school. I was teaching history in India, and then later on when we shifted to the Gulf, I was teaching over there. And history, after having done my master's under these people, history was my something that I was very passionate about, and I tried to convey that to my students also. And I know many students who did later on take on history because they said, now ma'am, you've made it interesting. So that continued, and then after that my husband got transferred to Dubai, and while I was living there, I went into this that the mode that they show in the serials and all, of really doing nothing except having a lot of fun. And after a year of that, I realized that this is not the kind of life I want. And at that point of time, my daughter was living in Delhi. And so I came to visit her in Delhi. And this was the first time I came to Delhi, not as a transit point, but as a place to stay in. And I went for a heritage walk with a group called Delhi Caravan. And I went to Lal Kot, which is the first city of Delhi. And I still remember, this is 2013, and I was standing there. And before I had gone, I had done a lot of research on where I'm going, because I'm a very curious person by nature. I want to know everything about whatever I'm going to be doing. So I had studied, and I realized there's nothing much written about Delhi at that point of time, apart from some Urdu books. Of course, you had two very, very authentic, what should I say, seminal works of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and Bashiruddin Ahmad. And then you had Monuments of Delhi in English by Maulana Zafar Hassan, and a couple of accounts by Britishers, especially Hearns, who's written Seven Cities of Delhi. But the English accounts were written from a colonial point of view, and they were not updated. And that's when I was standing there, and I said, people just don't know the amount of rich literature that we have about these monuments in Urdu. And that's the point when I remember standing there and telling Asif, I'm going to write a book on Delhi. And he said, all the best. And that was we were in Mehroli. I thought I'd write just one book, but then it just went on. The journey just continued, and I kept improving myself, kept reading, researching, trying to be better with each day and with each book, each page.
Ira, we'll come to you. Your latest book is a departure in the sense that your previous book was in a completely different sphere. I think it's fair to say that it inhabited the same world that Ruby's work is stationed in. But when we're talking about Akbar, I mean, all the way back from, I don't know, Vincent Smith, well, all the way back from Abul Fazl, right, and Badayuni, those trio, and Nizamuddin Ahmed, to Vincent Smith, to, Irfan Habib Saab, Akbar and His Times, to Andre Wink, and all of these, even Mani's book, right, Mani Mukta's book, which came out last year. I mean, you have this grand, archetypal, larger-than-life figure. So what attracted you to this particular character? Why did you want to do a revisitation of Akbar?
Yes, thank you, Avik. Thank you for that question and such an interesting conversation already. I would just in the beginning like to make a little clarification in that I would not consider my earlier work separate from my Akbar work. I think our point is that the histories of women should become mainstream in a way. We should be talking about the influence of women within men's lives side by side, if you like, in a parallel sort of way. So in a way, I did not want to become a writer only of something which became women's stories. But the fact is that with the books that I was writing, though you said I've covered a range of topics, but in a way, I was sort of skirting around the issue of Akbar, even from my very first book. Because whenever you talk about the Mughals, there's a sort of a fulcrum about the Akbari period. So even when I talk about the later Mughals, when I talked about the later women of the Mughals in my second book, you could see the effect of Akbar at the time of Shah Jahan, at the time of even Aurangzeb. There's always a reference to Akbari systems, to the land revenue system, to his policies on religion, on jizya, and so many things. There's always this sort of a midpoint, if you like, to which people are referring themselves into and shaping themselves around. And even when you look at the period, the Padshahs before Akbar, of course, the way Abu al-Fazl has created the biography, he in a way subsumes the histories of Babur and Humayun into Akbar's reign. So in a way, he makes it seem as though Humayun was special because he was going to be Akbar's father. Akbar's mother was special. She had this, light on her forehead because she was about to be the mother of this great figure, Akbar. So he had this, genius for bringing in even the earlier Mughals into the Akbari period. So I realized that there was something, obviously very special around the 50 years that Akbar reigned. So that was one fascinating thing that I wanted to explore more. And the second being that there was also another strange dichotomy about Akbar in that when I was writing Daughter of the Sun, and I used Ruby La's scholarship heavily, and through that I was able to see that the earlier Mughal women were very visible in a way. At the time of Babur, at the time of Humayun, they were extremely visible. There was no veiling in the sense that we think of it, no parda, no sequestered space. Even post Akbar, the time of Shah Jahan, you have these wonderful princesses, unmarried daughters, who may not have been visible in the traditional sense, but you could sense their power and their influence. But what happened there at the time of Akbar again vis-a-vis the women? Why did they suddenly become Parde Gyan? Why did all these new innovations come around about giving them titles which hid their their identities, which Abu al-Fazl goes on referring to them as chaste women, endlessly. What happened? And yet at the same time, we know that Akbar had actually some, extremely modern views, if you like, about women. He was very sensitive to their vulnerability, both under Islam and under Hinduism. So the Hindus, he criticized sati. He wanted, divorced and widowed women to be able to remarry. He could not understand this. Under the laws of Islam, he questioned the laws of inheritance, which favored men over, boys over girls. So he was extremely forward-thinking in a certain way, and yet the consequences of his, innovations and the way in which he created the image of his sovereignty led to an effacing of the women around him. So this was another thing that interested me, and I thought, we are talking about one of the great men in our history. Let's see where the women fall into his life. Surely he didn't come fully formed, this magnificent emperor. There must have been mothers, and sisters and aunts, as we well know. So these were the sort of things that I was hoping to, make clear through my writing.
Oh, absolutely. And whenever one talks about Akbar, of course, in a popular sense, with the general public, you have this great slew of myths and legends. You have the Navratna and you have the Suli Kul. So during your research and your book, are you debunking some of these myths, and are you sort of unraveling some of these knots to get to the truth? What's your discovery?
So, we were talking about sources early on, and so of course the type of sources that are available to us for Akbar are enormous, and apart from the Persian sources, the Jesuit sources, the European sources, the myths are very much part of that source. What were behind these myths? How much of it are possibly accurate? What do they signify? This was also a very interesting, part of my research. Akbar Birbal is something that people ask me about endlessly. There's a fascination about, I think it probably, the fascination is with who did Akbar love most? Did he love Jodha most? Was there a person called Jodha? Did he love Birbal most? Who was the favorite in Akbar's life? So there's this fascination about knowing Akbar at a human level. What was he like? What were the men and women around him like? What are even his animals around him like? Because, I found there were so many animals that were actually part of his life that shaped his personality. So these were, all the sources that I tried to use, including the myth making and the reasons behind them, to bring us, I think, an Akbar, a human being that we could believe in, who had frailties and vulnerabilities, who made mistakes as well, who had favorites, and who evolved despite all that, through that, to leave us this magnificent legacy.
Yes, absolutely. So Ruby, we'll go back to the point of sources. And in that context, let's talk about the historiography of female or women chroniclers. And this is something that we talked about when we were chatting earlier, that purely in historiographical terms, you have Harbans Mukhiaji's book, you have another book called Historians of Medieval India, which is published around the same time, edited by Mughal Hassan, and so many of the others, right? It is as if Gulbadan Begum is at best relegated to a corner or not mentioned at all. And I was, ever since that conversation, which took place about like 3.5 weeks ago, right? I was not just racking my brains, but racking through the databases that I have to try and see if there are any redeeming features, right? And I was like, okay, where are the history men, right? Why aren't they talking about Gulbadan Begum? And the only two instances I could find when they're still not talking about Gulbadan Begum, let alone a biography of hers, is tangentially. So there's S.K. Banerjee's Humayun Badshah, where he does concede and that he does say that, yes, this is a small, incomplete work. There's just only 80 folios, but this is very interesting and, Humayun's half-sister, etc. The other is Kolika Ranjan Kanungo. Interestingly, his PhD thesis was when he was, this young protege of Sir Jodhanath, like in 1925, 1924. And at that point of time, there is absolutely no mention of Gulbadan Begum in his original monograph, right? Now, when he, at the age of 70, revisits that, and he writes this big tome, The Lives and Times of Sher Shah, published in 1965. Interestingly, a lot of his previous conclusions are revised on Gulbadan Begum's authority. So that tells me that, from the time that this guy was 25 years old, and he became 70, and it actually took him 70 years to entrust a 65-year-old Mughal princess as she was then when she was writing the Humayun Nama. And he's finally conceding, yes, Gulbadan was right. But apart from this, I just couldn't, find any other sort of redeeming traces. So what's going on? Where are the history men?
Well, I think it's Avik, the problem is not that, they won't even recognize Gulbadan. They'll say yes. The question is, what do you do with that memoir, right? I mean, in some of the accounts, as you know, my dear senior colleague Harbans Mukhia wrote this book, the History and Historians of Akbar's Age, and there's a chapter called The Minor Historians of Akbar's Age, and you have Johar and others in the main script, and on the first page there's a little footnote in which he says, I don't have very much to say about Gulbadan on who whatever had to be written has been written by way of Annette Beveridge's translation, which was 100 years ago. So this comes back to, so this is a op-ed I'm writing on male disbelief. This is about I want to say a few things. One is this relates to the whole issue of what we constitute as legitimacy, right? What is a legitimate documentation? But more importantly, who decides that that is the legitimate documentation? So the land has been laid out that only the Akbarnama will constitute as documentation, or in other words, whatever is state sponsored and what is empress centered is constituted. If that were the case, then Rana Safvi's work cannot happen, right? How do you think about spaces? How do you think about mentalities? How do you think about vulnerabilities? But I think somewhere along the line there is also for a very long time now, I believe that people think, when they think about gender, first of all, they equal gender as women, right? And then they believe that this is a completely separate world that has nothing to do with the male, domains. The worlds that we are interested in and my co-panelists are interested in, it is, in fact, I think, very much like the male world, but with very different manifestations. It's a deeply imbricating world, right? Politics is not just out there, and household is not just for the private satisfaction of love or progeny. These are very deeply imbricated issues into the making of the empire itself. And I think that is what Gulbadan so beautifully brings to the fore. So if you begin to appreciate in your history the everyday, the challenges, the contestations, the uncertainties, what Ira was calling the vulnerabilities, that's when you begin to appreciate sources as Gulbadan. There's just so much there. And then a very quick point that the memoir breaks off. We need to think what happened to that breakage, right? Why the breakage, took place. Not just that the manuscript is lost and we haven't found another one. Those are all the sources, all the issues that I'm getting into in order to write this new biography of Gulbadan that I'm currently working on. So I think the problem is much more than taking on a source. Why don't you take it on? What is it that in the source itself that recoils you? It's exactly like not taking on art history, by historians. So there are all these compartmentalizations that take place. Art historians doing art history, women's historians only looking at poetry and something called the soft society. All these kinds of, what I believe, huge compartmentalizations that does not let you bring on versatile, feeling, touching histories that we need to hear. That actually, I think the so-called wider audience deeply connects with.
Absolutely. I mean, because you talked about the very translation of the Humayun Amara, and just take that. At that point of time, you had Sir H.M. Eliot, you had William Irvine, you had Sir Jodhanath Shorkar, and you had Henry Beveridge. All of them were exceptionally good Persian scholars. Any of them could definitely have translated. Instead, it falls to Henry Beveridge's wife. And Beveridge translated that, right? And then for the longest time, apart from the couple of sort of exceptions that we mentioned, nobody is talking about her work, nobody's referencing her work. Fast forward to, I don't know, 1984 or 85, where you have a non-historian like Roma Godin writing a book, Princess Rosebody. Not a very highly researched book, but an eminently engaging, readable book on Gulbadan Begum, a woman. 100 years after Anna Beveridge's translation, there is another woman, in this case Ruby Lal, who takes up the mantle. And again, in this entire span of 100 years plus, there are no men. Even though by that time, the translation is already there, it's out there for the taking and can be referenced at will. So that's something, I found quite bizarre.
Yes. Avik, I think the problem that I'm pointing to here, let me just sum this up differently. I think it's obviously critical, and I think that's what women's studies and feminist and gender sexuality studies made central. Of course, taking women's accounts, poetry, all sorts of things. But it's also, I do not believe that this is a history, the history that I'm writing, domesticity and power in the early Mughal world. It's centrally about empire formation. It's about the beginnings of peripatetic life. People imagine, when I read those Mughal histories, they were fully formed right from the beginning. So, what is a peripatetic yet aristocratic life under Babur and Humayun?
Right.
What happens when settlement begins to take place under Akbar? What kind of institutionalization, that we are talking about? And deeply imbricated into this is half their humanity. So what we are doing here is actually history. I don't want any qualifiers here. That is the point that we want to make very centrally. And we as women bring to the fore what hasn't been brought to the fore. That is essentially dealing with vulnerabilities, dealing with feelings, dealing with spaces, dealing with writings, paintings, poetry, right? Everything that's been considered non-legitimate, soft.
Yes. Right. Yep. Absolutely. Ranaji, we'll come to you next. So in terms of, when we're talking about sources, right, and primary sources. So in your case, obviously the sources are the monuments, the edifices themselves. But before we get to that, as part of your research through all of these years, all of these decades, have there been a lot of instances where you see either interpolations or colorations or presumably biases in the accounts, particularly those written by the colonial sort of British writers, that you've tended to sort of set right in your work?
So when I started writing about monuments, the first focus that I had was that I did not want to write it. Most descriptions of monuments are basically about the measurements and who made it and etc. About the details of construction. I also wanted to write, although it's a monument, but I wrote it as a narrative in a narrative style. And I wanted to narrate the events that happened in that particular monument. And in these past, I think, 7-8 years, I've visited more than 500 or 600 monuments in Delhi. Each monument I've gone to and studied it in detail, done whatever I had to, including climbing inside to the top of Qutub Minar. And I've tried and studied everything they're writing about. And apart from that, my basic sources were Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's Asaro Sanadi, which is the seminal work or the first work on Delhi monuments. Then Bashiruddin Ahmad's book Waqiat-e Darul Hukumat-e Delhi, and Maulvi Zafar Hussein's Monuments of Delhi. Now these three big books were my source. But after that, I did a lot of talking to the people there also to find out what do they feel about the monuments that they're living next to or sometimes inside the monument itself. Because it wasn't just telling the story of the monument. I wanted some kind of pride in our heritage to be inculcated and to, in us, especially the younger generation, because most of the monuments are very, very badly documented. And for example, like the first time I went to Firozshah Kotla, I told the taxi driver I want to go to Firozshah Kotla. He took me to the stadium. And I said, no, this is not where I want to come to. And he said, there's only this Firozshah Kotla. There is no Firozshah Kotla in Delhi. And so we had to find that. I had to tell him, no, that is another Kotla. That is the actual Kotla on which this stadium is named. So there was this kind of level of, influence about monuments, about the heritage that Delhi is. And that is what I've been trying to write about, and which is the main reason why I said I wanted to write about, to update what had been, say, Bashiruddin Ahmad wrote in 1919. So 100 years later, I tried to update all the accounts that he gave then as to what we have lost. So many monuments we have lost over, in fact, there are I think 30 monuments that have been lost since Sir Syed. And he doesn't mention all of them. And Bashiruddin Ahmad's account to now, I don't know how many we've lost, because he details each and every monument. So when I've been writing, I've also been trying to show what was and what is. especially in my latest book, Shah Jahanabad, The Living City of Delhi. I've talked of the hopes and aspirations of the people who are living there at the moment, and tried to show the grandeur and the glory of the city and the fort when Shah Jahan was there. Because today, what we see, either whether it's the city or the fort, it's just a shadow of its former self. So these are the things I've tried to do, and I've tried to also. When you said, I think you asked about interpretations and interpolations. So for
Yes.
Razi, when I went to the Qutub complex, the Qutub al-Islam Mosque as it's called now, inside that I was trying to figure out, I read that this is where Sultan Razia came before she was crowned the Sultan, and this is where she came and appealed as a petitioner to the people of Delhi. So I was trying to find out how she came, what happened. So I read a chance, this thing by colonial by a British author called Page, where he writes that there is a women's section in the Qutub Minar. So then I went again and I realized that not only the Quwwatul Islam Mosque, that not only the Quwwatul Islam Mosque, but every medieval mosque had a separate section for ladies, which was built on a and then I kept on researching, and then I realized that maybe this is where Razia was, and this is from there she came down and stood in the middle of the courtyard to say that, okay, your Iltutmish nominated me as his successor, saying that I was worthy of 20 of his sons. And nobles put the brother Ruknuddin on the throne, who turns out to be totally worthless. So then it is in this within this complex that she's crowned the Sultan, and suppose she is actually the first Sultan to be actually democratically elected. And as long as the people of Delhi were with her, nothing could happen to her. And then I started researching, because I grew up thinking of that of Razia, also as Razia Sultan, not as Sultan Razia, and thinking of her only in connection with Yakut. So whenever we talk of Razia, the only thing that comes into our mind is Hema Malini singing songs and Dharminder standing and languishing in front of her. So I wanted to break that myth. I kept on reading, and unfortunately at that time I didn't know Persian. I'm now like trying to learn. I can manage to read a little bit. So as I delved into the manuscripts, I realized that there's only one reference which says that when Yakut, who was the head of the stables, when he's lifting her to sit on the mounting the horse, he puts his hands under her arms. Now, he would have done the same for English. That is not the basis to start a romance, which is the romances that, we only hear of these legal romances. So I went on, and then I realized that he was a mentor for her, and also a person who was supporting her in when all the hostility by the Turkish slaves were going on around her by Balban and others. So for me, these were very satisfying moments to be able to find something. And after that, I've written a lot on Razia and how the romance is fictitious at best. So, and
Right.
other occasions also, even in the Red Fort, I've discovered like what is called the Mumtaz Mahal palace actually was where Jahanara lived. So to correct all those things that the Mumtaz Mahal was never here. Which is something people don't realize. They think, okay, this is the Red Fort, so Mumtaz Mahal must also have been living here. And you have a palace that's called Mumtaz Mahal Palace. And the name was Shahi Mahal, Banana Shah. So the Zanana Mahal Shahi became Mumtaz Mahal. So these are the types of myths that I've been trying to correct through my writing. And I don't know how far I'm succeeding or how correct it is, but as I said, for me, it's a continuously learning experience. So I keep trying to better myself, challenge myself, and go one step higher in the next book.
Absolutely. And you're chronicling your visualization, the way that you depict the monuments and you tell the stories behind them makes them really come to life, right? And what I love really is that you don't say, okay, this is what happened. So something as simple and as fundamental as Delhi or Dehla, right? Where does it get its name from? You will say there are all of these myths, there are all of these, and you take the reader through that journey. It's not like this is what I'm saying, therefore it's right. You have all of these, and then you slowly sort of, cut through the cloud, cut through the webs to arrive at what is possibly the authentic one. And I also really love the way, and it's absolutely constantly fascinated by the way in which you engage with your primary material, because your primary sources are those monuments themselves, right? I know of very, very few historians who would engage in such a tactile, visceral way, because when you're doing, let's say, walks in Shah Jahanabad, walks in the Old Fort, walks in, let's say, the Humayun's Tomb complex, my sense is that that engagement is taking place at least on two different levels. One is because you're talking to and you're basically educating your readers, your base, your fans, your followers. There are journalists who are enriched with that conversation, by that conversation. But at the same time, there's a deeper connect. There's an engagement with the material itself. And it's as if, the material is informing you, those stones, those debris are informing you anew and giving you fresh inspiration to go back and do new work.
So that is something, monuments are something I've been fascinated with ever since I remember. And I think I must have been 13 or 14 when I went to Fatehpur Sikri and fell in love with the buildings and the complex. And to date, that is my favorite monument, I should say city monument, whatever you want to call it. And I always, whenever I went, even when I was very young and I had no thoughts of doing history, I used to always feel that what are the stories that the people could tell us, that these stones could tell us, the things that happen. And they're not just bricks and stones, they are places where actual events happen. And those are the events that I've tried to bring live in my book. And even if a single stone is hurt, like recently I've heard about the railing in Taj Mahal that has broken down, it pains me. I feel a physical pain when I see any monument being damaged, or not only any heritage being damaged, because our heritage is what makes us. And knowing, as Ruby said, we have to be able to take history forward, not just let it be. So I try to do that. And as I said, for me, these are not ruins; these are stones which are actually speaking to me.
Which are live, which are exactly. And as you mentioned earlier, right? I mean, so much of it has been damaged through disrepair, through disregard, through not taking care of them. Indeed. Ira, we were talking about primary resources and primary sources. When we had our conversation earlier, you talked about the way in which you've used Mughal miniature paintings, right? Contemporary paintings, and read them to inform your narrative, to inform your story. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so this was, a particularly fascinating aspect of my work for me, and I got terribly sidetracked by it, from time to time, and would spend days just looking at miniatures. And of course, it is not, I who am interpreting them. It is art historians. They do some amazing work, especially in the last few decades. Some fantastic research has been coming out. But what I do is try and bring them into the period that I'm talking about, and make my own conclusions out of what is happening through those pictures. Now, the thing to remember is that I'm a writer of narrative history, so I'm writing primarily for a lay audience. And so for me, it is equally important, the research part of it, of course, all of that is extremely important, but I also give a lot of thought and time to the spinning of the story itself, because, I'm always thinking of a way in which to get my readers engrossed so that they will continue reading and, learning without really knowing that they are learning a lot of information. Mm-hmm. So, engrossing scenes, stories that will really interest the reader is something which is really important to me. And miniature paintings have been particularly important in this regard. For example, I was looking, I have a broad way of dividing Akbar's reign in 5 periods, depending, and I've based them on the 5 great works, each epitomizing that particular decade. But what happens around the 1600s is that suddenly, of course, just a few years before Akbar died, but otherwise he's, in very good health and, full of energy and showing no signs of stepping down or falling ill. But suddenly the works from his ateliers, become almost non-existent, and I looked around for a long time. I wrote to art historians, but apparently there wasn't a great deal of work coming from Lahore at that time, where Akbar was based. And yet something was happening in Allahabad, where Salim had in fact set up his own court, his rebel court, if you like, and started calling himself Shah Salim, started using coins in his name.
He sort of crowned himself emperor already, right?
Yes, exactly. And one of the attributes of an emperor, a symbol of sovereignty, was to have the great painters around you. And what happened is a lot of the young painters, the second generation painters, the sons of the great masters, who had grown up alongside Salim in Lahore, actually migrated to this court, to his rebel court in Allahabad, and they started painting for him and adding to especially intriguing manuscript called the Murakka Gulshan, which is a sort of scrapbook which Salim put together. It's a sort of imperial Mughal scrapbook where he would choose images that he liked from the past, even going back to Babur's time and before, which were in the Mughal library. He pieced them together, made a nice border around them, and started accumulating this fascinating album, this Murakka. And when you look at these images, you sort of see what Salim is doing. He's taking Timurid princes to say, I am actually this great Timurid prince. I will bring back Timurid glory. Akbar has strayed too far down, syncretism and that sort of thing. Vote for me, if you like, in a way. This is the sort of prince that I am going to be. And Padshah, in fact, because he's claiming that he's Shah Salim. So it was fascinating for me to see that Akbar's influence over the painters in a way seemed to have lessened, and these young painters who had known Salim from the time that they were children had gone to Allahabad, and he had managed in a way to send this wordless challenge to his father. Now, he was never as great a warrior as his father. He would never build buildings that Akbar did. He did nothing really which would equal in a way Akbar's legacy. But in a way, he seems to be telling us, posterity, look what I've been able to do. I'm a great connoisseur of art, and my atelier is greater than my father's. So in a way, that sort of supported the findings that I was coming across. That of course is well known, this rift between father and son, and Salim, stepping away from the influence of his father in Lahore and creating his own court.
Absolutely, and what's great is about the way that Jahangir is actually trying to cull out his own legacy, not through great wars of conquest and succession, but through paintings, right? So he is atop a globe, he's atop a lion, and he's embracing the Persian Shah Abbas, but Shah Abbas is atop a sheep or a lamb, right? So that tells you the relative in Jahangir's estimate, right? In the Mughal's estimate, what's the relative equation, what's the relative power balance or imbalance, and it's therefore, Jahangir, who's like as in the Tariq Alfi, he's like the Badshah of the millennium. It's that kind of a projection that you see in many of these allegorical portraits, right? In the latter period of Jahangir. Right, yes. Exactly. I'm getting a large number of questions, and some of them actually have a lot to do with what we spoke about, Ruby, the first time we talked, and that is the politicization of history, right? And in recent years, you see this more and more pronounced. And now it's like every week there has to be like a new controversy, right? So you name a flyover after Savarkar, and that's a problem. You name a statue, or you create or you erect a statue of Swami Vivekananda, that's a problem. Akbar, whose name means great, is no longer great. Aurangzeb was like the worst thing that ever happened to humankind, right? Tipu Sultan should be taken off the pages of history. Dara Shikoh has had a posthumous recoronation, right? All of these things are happening. What's your view on this?
And I think, I'll just say something about two contradictory trends that I think are taking place in India. On the one hand, as we all know, there's been this, there's been this kind of tsunami of books on the Mughals, right? Everything is coming out, and and on the other hand, since 2016, starting with Maharashtra, there's been demonization of, and I'm just taking the Mughals as an example. We can take any number of examples.
Sure.
As a Mughal historian, I want to take that example. There's been the demonization, if you will, even if you slightly cast, Akbar as, in opposition to Shivaji, but Shivaji looks great. The idea that we need to rewrite our history from the point of view of what is not being done. And here I'm talking about school textbooks, right? And this kind of, wiping out of history, this kind of reassertions, demonization, communalization of history, patronization of history, that's taking place. So that is a very strong move that's going on. And there are many, many manifestations of this. On the other hand, we have these books coming out. The question for me is this going to make any difference to, the history of India? What is the history of India, right? The question for me was not simply rescuing, and here I'm talking about Noor Jahan. The question for me was not simply, bringing to the fore this kind of fabulous, ruler, but also the question, how does something like that become possible? How's that implemented? And here, what is Hind like? Who lives here? What is the pluralistic ethics, right? How did we live in those days, right? And I think if we don't take those questions on seriously in the writing that we are doing, right, I think it's going to be, I shudder to think what's happening to, my Muslim families in India. And I'm deeply, deeply attached, to my friends, to my family, to this history, to this sense of a shared. It's so. In other words, a little bit of biryani and a little bit of beautiful image. All of this is allowed. But what happens to our senses? What happens to the fact that my mother, who's a practicing Hindu, without bashing an eyelid, first told me the story of Noor Jahan? I want to ask, how many middle-class Hindu mothers can do this today, right? So this is the question. This is what gives me sleepless nights, right? This is what this is what I'm worried about. So I don't want these histories to become little exotic facts, right? Oh, he did this and she did this. Oh, there was a beautiful manuscript and there was this and there was that. To me, there's heartache involved in it. I think this is not an answer, but this is, this is lamentation. And I think that's what's going on. So, what kind of historians do we want to be? How do we want to link with these spaces? What kind of history do I want to teach, right? This is at the heart of these contradictions that I'm
Ranaji, in the same vein, right? You've been documenting, you've been chronicling the edifices all through the Delhi Sultanate and into the Mughal period and beyond, right? But if you have a parallel narrative, which is strongly becoming the dominant one, that they're all invaders. Everybody from Ahmad al-Ghazni, Muhammad Ghori, and the Mughals, they're all invaders just as much as the British. And therefore, the only thing that is authentic Hindustani or Bharatiya itihas, right, is maybe 1,000 years old, going back to the Hori sort of mythical past, right? Now that creates several basic problems. How do you react to this?
The first problem that I face when I'm writing is that this constant interpolation that this, like say for example the Red Fort. There was somebody on prime time television saying that this Red Fort was built by Anandpal Tomar. Now that Red Fort is and separated by about 26-27 miles. Yet that is again something that I face a lot of, that every monument that has been built by whether the Delhi Sultanate or the Mughals is said to have been either a temple or something associated with the temple. So that was my first thing to find out, that what was it. Like for example, for the Taj Mahal, when I went to read Desmond and Begley, that Begley and Desai, that book has Farman in it, and that Farman is unfortunately locked up in the city palace of Jaipur in the Kapur Dwara collection. which so the Farman very clearly states that in lieu of this manzil of Mansingh, he is being given 4 other manzils. Now, manzil denotes a house. So when we talk about because these things are never the research, and a lot of research has been done on almost every subject was within academia. So I am now bringing it out as far as monuments are concerned, like Ruby's book and Huda's book. Now, narrative history is being written for the lay person, and that is going a long way in correcting myths, correcting misconceptions, because people are being able to read it. Earlier, it was within it was confined to a smaller group of people, and as I said, I remember in my master's for my architecture paper, I had done this. I had written a dissertation on the Taj Mahal, which was the first time I had heard about this Farman, and after that I'd forgotten. Now, to get to this Farman, I had to order the book from USA. This Begley and Desai is not available in India, so I had to get it from USA. So these are the difficulties we face, and which is why so much of misinformation is being spread. That Red Fort was built by Tomar, they destroyed the Tomar fort, there was a temple here. So all these things we have to face. And after there have been demolitions of temples, which I mentioned, like the Mughal Islam mosque, that 27 temples were demolished to build this, and the pillars from there were reused. So wherever it is, I have written whatever with that. Yes, here there was a reuse, but here this is very, like Red Fort has been built everything was new that was built over there. It was not on the site of another fort or by demolishing temples or anything.
Absolutely. I think, Ranaji, one of the fundamental problems with that is that nobody really reads the academic scholarly work. So, for example, all 4 of us can talk, I think, reasonably cogently and agree about the fact of demolition, the process of it, and who actually did it. But it's never coming out onto the public forum. So let me make a start here, right, in a small way. Let's talk about the seminal research by Richard Eaton, who talks about temple desecration over almost 1 millennium, right? And he makes a very clear distinction, because the popular narrative is Alauddin Khilji went and ravaged the entire countryside, all of Hindustan was destroyed, right? Whatever was left a few centuries later, Aurangzeb does irreparable damage. Done, right? Whereas the fact of the matter, as Richard Eaton points out, is there are 2 things. One is demolition, the other is desecration. The moment you're talking about touching anything of a very pure edifice as a mandir, it's desecration. And he points out numerous instances where there are internecine wars between Hindu rajas of rival clans and factions, right? Where one raja wins over the other, promptly goes in, does not demolish the temple, does not raze it to the ground, but desecrates it nevertheless, because everything, all the dham daulat, if you will, right, all the khazana which is there in the temple is taken back, is repatriated to his kingdom, and at times, many times, the gold and sort of decked with jewels, those images of the gods and goddesses are also lifted by one Hindu Raja from another Hindu Raja's temple and reinstalled in his own. What would you call that, right?
So that is, the best part of that book that Eaton, when he starts the book, he starts with the 2 journeys, one of Mahmud Ghazni towards Sarnath and the other of this king to Bengal. And I went to Sarnath recently, and I'm doing a project I'm doing some audio guides for monuments. So outsourced by ASI. And I went to Sarnath and I had a wonderful, wonderful experience. And then when I started reading Ramala Thopper's book on Sarnath, and she said that there is hardly any discussion on the kind of invasions that we talk about. There are a couple of invasions, of course, but not the kind of narrative of the invasions that we are seeing today, that Mahmud Ghazni came from the times and did this. And there's a mosque that has been made by the Hindu traders for some Muslim traders who are coming to the port. Then from that, there are so many other narratives there. And one beautiful experience I'd like to share with our viewers, that when I went to Sarnath, I had gone with a lot of permissions to be able to go and photograph there for the app. And when I went there, and my name is a very general name, so people don't realize. When I went there, the person who was showing me around, he saw I wear a very big turquoise ring. And he saw me and he asked me, he said, "Are you a Muslim?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Is that a problem?" He said, "No, why should that be a problem?" And I was inside Sarnath temple, and for me, that was such a beautiful moment that, because I was feeling very, for me, visiting any religious monument is a very spiritual moment. I feel very connected to God whenever I'm in any place of worship. So that was a wonderful moment for me. And as I said, Rana Safvi talks about it, of, like I think Ruby wants to add something here.
Yes. Please
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was going to bring up Ramila Thapar's Somnath book, in which if you take
Somnath, I was saying Sarnath. Somnath is what I meant.
no problem. In which she actually, gets into Sanskrit inscriptions and other inscriptions. And, there's a very incredible moment in the book in which she details, the place where it's assumed that Ghazni attacked. Right there, she thinks about an inscription, a Sanskrit inscription that was issued by the local temple, in which they gave the money by the premises for the building of a mosque, right? So I think that is the kind of history we need to bring out. We need to chart. We need to consider. I think this question that we can decide who builds first, archaeologically, I believe, cannot be decided. I think people who worked on the Babri Masjid during the time of the demolition in the 1990s, this was one of the fact-finding things, that it was absolutely impossible to establish what was before, what was underneath, what was all of these kinds of things. And I think sediments, the key word, sediments, is just fantastic. We are talking about the sediments of our history, the layers of our history, the multiple forms of belonging, the richnesses, right? That's all I wanted to add.
Absolutely. Ira, weigh in on this matter as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, all of you have said extremely relevant things, and this essentializing of history, that we bring everybody down to their religion, Muslim versus Hindu. It's just not the way in which people thought of themselves, in the medieval, early modern world. There were so many other parts that, made up your identity, cultural, your ethnic, your clan, where you are from, geographically speaking, your cuisine. So many different things contributed to a sense of who you were. And one example that I can say, from my work, apart from the miniatures and many other sources, I use the Rajput sources quite a bit as well, because Ruby was talking about how we prioritize certain languages, certain sources like Persian, and Brajbhasha has been neglected. So all these sources in Brajbhasha, a very rich, scholarship has come out of the studying of, Brajbhasha by many academics, and I was able to look at some of those, and they really enriched my sense of how the Rajput reacted to this new Mughal hegemony, if you like, this new reality in which Mughals were all powerful. And one example, Raja Man Singh, who was one of the great Mansabdars of Mughal, of Akbar's time, he built this beautiful fort in Rohtas, and he had two inscriptions side by side, which Rana, sent me a picture of one day when she had visited it. There was one inscription in Sanskrit and one in Persian, and the one in Persian refers to the great Padshah Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, who was the great Padshah of his time, and that Raja Man Singh has just built a fine temple. In Sanskrit, he's given himself a wonderful title, Maharaja Adhiraj Maharaja of the Mughal Empire. No mention of the emperor. So this just shows you how much more complicated people's identities were, how they negotiated their realities in much more nuanced way than we give them credit for. And hopefully, our work, things like this, which bring out this reality to people, will show them that it wasn't so black and white and so binary.
Indeed. Ira, there's one of the questions that flashed in earlier in the show. I'm just reading it out. It says, what do you say of such orders from Akbar prohibiting women from riding horses or punishing for walking without the veil?
Okay.
Is there any truth to that? Is there any farman to that effect?
Not a Farman. I know at one point later on he wrote, he did give some orders about women if they misbehaved in a certain way in a town, they were to behave in a certain manner. If they were married and not run around, I don't know what he had witnessed, which troubled him so much. But you need to see. My point is that I have written quite an extensive book with many layers of understanding of what shaped Akbar's attitude towards women. So it's very, a little random to pull out one fact or one thing you may have read about in popular history and say, what do you think about this aspect? Whereas his attitude towards women was changing and forming throughout his life. And this would be part of his attempt to invisibilize, if you like, the royal women, because this was the new way in which it was considered elite. Maybe some ideas he got from elite Rajput houses who had also begun putting their women in parda. So maybe these two were Mughal and Rajput fed on each other and created the sense of if you had elite women, you had to hide them. So this possibly, fed into that notion of they will not be seen in public riding horses, for example, though I haven't seen anything in particular. But you need to see it in the context of that time and all the other changes which were happening and where they came from.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. We've gone well over time. Maybe just last question to you, Ruby, which was one of the viewers had asked us earlier, and that has more to do with education and the way that we teach the discipline or the practice of history, particularly in India. It's treated as something very, very dry and sort of intimidating, forbidding, quite difficult to access. And that in turn then has lots of problems compounding over the years as one gets into research and then one publishes books and produces original work. Do you think there is fundamentally any problem with the way that we study, that we teach, that we disseminate history in the academics today?
I think there is the old disciplinary legacy, and history is kind of very tightly bound by dates, which is why it's so male-centered. And I think that ought to be challenged. I think there's a lot of places and lots of people in India, who are challenging the teaching of history writing. I mean, I can straight away think of one prime institution in Delhi, and I'm sure you can multiply this. Ashoka University, that's really trying very hard to rethink the idea of the humanities itself and being part of their conversation. But I have colleagues in Aligarh Muslim University, people like Shadab Bano, who've been doing this absolutely marvelous work in terms of rewriting history, in terms of rethinking history. Nadeem, Ali Nadavi, he's written this phenomenal book on Fatehpur Sikri. So I think there are lots of people who are rethinking the boundaries. But most importantly, really, I think the millennials, the younger people, are so ready. I have two young nieces, 12 and 17 in school. Overall, just suddenly very passionate about history. So something is happening, and these are the contradictions that I was pointing out.
Yes.
And I think these educational tours, history as it's not just history. There's this other sense of history in the past somehow, but it's not how the past constitutes us. It's also how we constitute the past. Right?
Yes, indeed.
We can bring that to the fore, right? I think at least that's what I do in my classroom, where I have a lot of students from India.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think fundamentally, as long as there is openness and there is curiosity to understand and just probe and learn more about and ask ourselves questions about the human condition, that itself, I think, can give us hope, going forward, that, maybe not all is lost. We've gone horribly over time, 15 minutes over time. But I haven't been, blacklisted by the moderator as yet. But Rubilal, Rana Safvi, Ira Mukhoty, it has been absolutely wonderful. We've called this the History of Women. We could just as well have called this the Enchanted Hour. And I'm hoping that this is the first of many such sessions that we can do together. Viewers, I hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll come back with a new set of guests, same time next week. Until then, stay safe. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.